Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Equinix Tech Talk series. Today, we are covering the topic, why you need an AI-ready high-performance data center with Equinix and Dell Technologies. We are so glad to have you attend. Our speaker is Glenn Deckheiser, a global principal on Equinix's global technical sales team, and Rob Shear, Global Alliance's CTO for AI and data management at Dell Technologies, will take you through the components of what makes an AI-ready data center. Now, I'll turn it over to our Equinix Global Principal, Glenn Deckheiser.
Thank you, Tracy. One of the best things about working at Equinix is seeing firsthand what customers of all sizes are doing on a global scale. Lately, many of our customer conversations revolve around AI because, as many are discovering, executing an AI strategy can be much tougher than past projects. The big challenge is that success hinges on a much stronger integration between lines of business, application owners, and foundational IT infrastructure. Like Equinix, Dell also enjoys a global perspective, working with our joint customers to drive AI and many other IT outcomes all over the world. So I'll turn to my colleague, Rob. In your discussion with Dell customers around AI, what's been your experience and how are they approaching it?
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. So, if you look at some of the stats on the screen, we're seeing that, most people are trying AI in some part of their life, over 80%. And then we have, over 60% are using it at the office. But with that, most companies, over 70% of companies are still struggling to find value in generative AI. So I think it's a huge opportunity for all of us to work together to solve that challenge.
So of all the challenges that the customers are having, what are you seeing as the types of challenges they're trying to solve? Because AI can take so many forms.
Yeah, so, there's a number of use cases. I'm just going to kind of build this slide out for a second. Anywhere from, content creation to code generation is a huge, easy way to get started, helping your developers be more efficient. Digital assistants, I think everybody needs a digital assistant, right? Avatar goes a long way. Digital twins. So many use cases for computer vision. And then things like, design and creation of synthetic data are really good ways to get started in the space.
Is everybody just going out there and training their own models? I heard a lot of things about, I've got to go buy 100,000 GPUs to go get AI done. Is that what you're seeing?
So we would love everybody to buy 100,000 GPUs. That's a great, way. But no, in all seriousness, right? If we take a look at this chart here, and I'll kind of build it out a little bit. We see on the far right, a year ago, 18 months ago, I think everybody thought everybody would be doing model training, right? Every major enterprise would need to do model training. But, as it turns out, you don't need to do that, right? There's a small number of companies spending a lot of money buying those hundreds of thousands of GPUs to build models that are then, made available to you, either through, open source tools or via, a subscription model, right? So,
would that be like Hugging Face would be a place to go get those models?
Absolutely. Hugging Face is a great place to go. There's I don't know, thousands of models, available on a Hugging Face. And what you do, and what we're seeing really kind of like the sweet spot for large enterprise is really kind of this middle spot where they're using something called retrieval augmented generation. And what retrieval augmented generation allows you to do is take one of those standard models from Hugging Face and then create a database of your own information that sits next to it, right? So you don't have to train your own model. You use a standard model that knows how to speak English or whatever language you want it to speak. And you just augment it with your information. And now it knows about your business, your processes, or whatever you're training to do. And that's where we're seeing the bulk of the workload. And then what happens is that sometimes people start with retrieval augmented generation and they decide, we need to actually do a little bit of fine tuning. And fine tuning does require a little more GPU than retrieval augmented generation, but it allows you to actually take one of the standard models and then add information directly into it and make it a little better for your organization.
So do you see customers doing this a lot in the cloud? Or are they doing it, where are they doing this the most? Where do they want to do it?
Yeah, so Dell's point of view is you want to bring AI to your data, right? So we're seeing people do this on the cloud. We're seeing them do it on-prem. But we created something called the Dell AI Factory with NVIDIA to make it easier for people to actually deploy this and be more successful, right? So, like any good factory, it has to produce something, right? So the Dell AI Factory produces, use cases and business outcomes. But the fuel for the factory is data, right? And like you were saying before, data could come from anywhere, right? Data could come from on-prem, it could come from the edge, and that edge could be, the retail edge, the healthcare edge, the manufacturing edge. It could come from the cloud, right? We see a lot of places where you're getting feeds from ServiceNow, or you're doing customer sentiment analysis. You're seeing feeds from Twitter and from all these kind of places coming in, all coming into purpose-built infrastructure, right? There's a ton of AI software coming in, and of course, a lot of services to make this all come together.
So this AI factory, is it something I can go, like, is it a thing, or is it like more of a way of life?
So it's more of a way of life, right? It's not like a SKU. I mean, we do have t-shirt sizes, right? So I will say, like, we do have small, medium, large, right? But for the most part, it's an approach, right? And every customer is going to have a slightly different use case, right? So you're going to want to size it and make it a little more fit for your needs. But the point is to have a standardized approach, which makes it much more easy to deploy. You get up and running faster. And by working with Equinix, Dell, and NVIDIA together, we shorten the window to actually see those results on the right, to get those use cases out.
So we'll get to the Equinix part in a second, but let's say I'm an enterprise and I'm talking to Dell, and I'm just starting to look into getting my AI life going, right? So I want to start down this journey. I've got all this data around my enterprise. What's my first step? What's the first thing I can do to get going here? What's the lowest hanging fruit for me to get my value?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because one of the things I always like to say is, enterprises have data everywhere and nowhere, right? It's scattered across business units, scattered across systems of record, and there's a political aspect to it, right? Because you have to get people to work together, and there's obviously a technical aspect to it, right? But we always like to start with data discovery, right? Like, where is the data? How do we start looking at pairing this data together, right? Because different systems may have the same data but call them something a little bit differently. Aligning across the enterprise, and then we have things like where we prepare the data and we work with data scientists, and there's a whole piece of that. Dell has a great solution called the Dell Data Lakehouse, which helps to front end all of this data, and it's something we can deploy. It's an appliance. It's kind of a turnkey appliance we can put in, and allows you to have a single place to go to see all your data at once. And one of the nice things about the data lakehouse is that in the past, we had data warehouses, and we had data lakes, and we had Hadoop. But the challenge was you had to move all your data, right, to one central place. And that's just too hard for most people. Like, it's just, nobody wants to move all their data around. If it lives in one spot, they want to keep it there. And the Dell Data Lakehouse allows you to access the data in place, but still maintain all the access privileges, all the privacy that comes with that. So that approach, we find, makes a big difference in terms of getting our projects moving faster.
It sounds like there's a lot of sovereignty play for that as well. And it also sounds like having all that data flying around, especially since it's data that's private to the company, requires some private interconnection. So I think we're going to get to that later. But by the way, are there any of these big GPU needs in the data lakehouse solution?
So the data lakehouse itself actually doesn't require a lot of GPU, right? It's an appliance we have. It's a partnership we have with Starburst, and it's a great, easy way, to get in the door, right, with that.
So what you're saying is I can get started as an enterprise with AI, focusing on my data, getting it prepared and dressed up for AI, and not have to think about all the advanced architectural, foundational, technical things for these GPUs, all this stuff that we're going to get into as far as infrastructure. But I can get started now with the things I almost know how to do today with the infrastructure I maybe have at my disposal today and know how to manage.
Yeah, because yes, right. Because the key being, if you don't have your data house in order, you're never going to be able to fuel your AI deployment, right? So this is really step one or zero. Once you decide what you want to do, understanding what data you're going to need to put into the system, and getting that together is certainly something you want to do early on in the deployment.
All right. Well, we've kind of alluded to, okay, now you've got this data lakehouse, and even though it's a distributed thing, now I'm going to start to look at, where do I put all of this AI technology, whether it's GPU based or non-GPU based, right? So why don't you give us a little bit on that, on what Dell's view is on where you put this stuff and why.
Yeah, so there's obviously a couple of big ways to go, right? You could do this workload in the cloud. You can do it on-prem in a private setting. So when we look at that, we look across these series of metrics. Where do you need secure access, right? How are you accessing the data? Where is the data currently, right? And these little balls are obviously, these little circles are going to move depending on where you are and your company is. Are there general purpose use cases? Like, one of the nice things about starting in the cloud, it's very quick and easy, right? You can spin up use cases very quickly. But, as you scale, it can be more expensive, right? You start looking at, cost. Once again, a private deployment is generally going to be, less expensive to run long term. And if most of your data is already in a private setting, trying to move it back and forth, data has a lot of gravity, right? Trying to move it back and forth all the time isn't always the best use, right? If you have a lot in a certain spot, you want to make sure you're doing your AI, right there.
So in your experience, you work with some of the biggest companies in the world, and you've been with Dell quite a long time. Based on these considerations, right, Dell and Equinix have been partnering for quite some time. Dell's got the compute, the GPU, it's got the storage capabilities, the data motion capabilities. It's partnered with Starburst for the data lakehouse. It's got a lot of these let's call it layer 2 to layer 7, maybe beyond if you want to consider the political and economic parts of it. What's in your opinion the biggest value of partnering with Equinix when you're considering these considerations?
Yeah, one of the biggest challenges I'm seeing with companies is really data center space and power, right? So these systems draw a lot of power, right? So as you scale them up, most data centers were set up for, 10 kilowatt, 15 kilowatt racks. And these systems easily could be, 30, 40, 50, upwards of 100 kilowatt racks. The need potentially for, I think we're going to talk about water cooling in a minute, need for possible water cooling in the future. So not only do they require a lot of power and cooling, generally speaking, you're going to need high speed access to a lot of other data, right? And having that connectivity along with the power and the cooling, we find is really critical. And there have been so many projects I've worked on that have been kind of stymied by the lack of power and cooling in the data center. Or they have to do unnatural things and have one rack per server, or just things that and make the networking more complicated because you have crazy long runs and things like that.
Well, I guess it helps that Equinix enables you to deploy high density data center capacity right where the clouds, networks, and all the digital ecosystems meet. This means instant access to the data you need, powered by the liquid cooled environments that handle the most demanding workloads, right? So I think what you'll find is that Equinix is currently optimized to leverage liquid for cooling in 3 different ways that are meaningful for Dell and other customers, right? Anyone using GPUs. The first that we show here is direct-to-chip with liquid cooling. And we consider that the true liquid cooling solution. This is where cold plate sits right on top of the CPU inside the server. Cooling fluid runs through it to draw the heat away. And this method allows for the highest power density, right, for all those workloads. However, direct-to-chip cooling does require servers that accept it. So it looks like some of Dell's new AI servers do support direct-chip cooling. Can you speak to that for a minute?
Yeah, so our premier line of the XE9680 server, we released a version of that at Dell Tech World, right? Which is actually, it was interesting. It's a smaller unit, right? So the air-cooled version is 6U in height, and the liquid-cooled version is actually only 4U in height. But that allows us to work with the NVIDIA B200 chip and liquid cooler, right? And it makes a tremendous difference in the amount of heat it's putting off, right? The liquid cooling, I think reduces from like 11 kilowatts down to like in the 7,000 range. So, or the 7 kilowatt range. So it makes a noticeable difference.
So not all the solutions involve the B200, right? We do have solutions where we're dealing with, the older H100s, even L40s, right? And so, in those cases, Equinix also offers rear door heat exchangers. So that's where basically chilled liquid runs through a coil in the back of the rack, capturing heat from the equipment, pushing cool air back into the data center. Now, it's not exactly liquid cooling. We call it enhanced air cooling, since the server chips are still cooled by air. But this method does bring liquid closer to the rack. It makes the air cooling much more effective. And also, like rear door heat exchangers, in-row coolers enhance air cooling by bringing liquid closer to the heat-producing processors. These coolers are placed right next to your infrastructure, blowing colder air into the cold aisles and directly onto your hardware. Now, we do at Equinix think that direct-to-chip cooling is the most efficient of the three options, especially for customers looking to handle high-density workloads like the 9680s that you were speaking about. The increased density and cooling efficiency make it the best place to start. But if you're not ready for dedicated liquid cooling, right, for lots of reasons, budget, time, our enhanced air cooling options like rear door heat exchangers, in-row coolers are absolutely available and accepted globally, right? So, as we move forward in this conversation, right, we talked about cooling. We've talked about the three types of cooling solutions, but what we haven't talked about too much, especially with the data lakehouse solution, is what is the benefit of placing the data at Equinix, right? So when I first brought up the value of Equinix and Dell, you brought up you needed high density power and cooling. Well, the other thing that Equinix is a leader in the world on is the interconnectivity of data on a global scale, right? A lot of people just believe that this stuff just works when you put data endpoints all over your platform. And the reality is that unless you have interconnection that's deterministic in performance, in price, you don't want to get killed with bills, that you can deploy in an agile way, right? Your projects are going to be at risk if you can't do this. And what Equinix gives you as an enterprise is the ability to place that data right in the middle of pretty much the hub of the hybrid multi-cloud across the globe in every region that you're in. So the way we kind of see things moving forward is that you've got this life cycle where you're going to start in the cloud, maybe move to an as a service, and then perhaps do some stuff on-prem. You may want to connect data from your owned data centers, and have that ability to move and change your mind and go and attack new opportunities. And so unless you have the ability not just to have all the power and cooling in the right places around the world and be adjacent to all of the services in public cloud regions, you need to be able to instantiate connections very, very quickly to all of these things, not just to yourself, but also to your entire IT ecosystem, including your supply chain, your customers, et cetera. So,
yeah.
Well, go ahead.
No,
man.
I would say flexibility is the key, right? The market is moving very rapidly, right? And as much as we would like to say we could foresee the future, you know what? Nobody can foresee the future, right? So if in 6 months or a year you need access to new data sources, you can't wait forever to do that, right? The fact that Equinix could spin up connectivity in near real time is, once again, is another huge advantage, and gives you that flexibility as your projects, change over time.
Yeah. So one of the things that, we see is that, and we love what Dell is doing with the AI factory concept, especially with data lakehouse and approaching the data first to get that ready for AI. We really do believe that Equinix should be that home, for all the advantages that enterprise can wring out of this. Putting that data lakehouse across the Equinix platform gives you access to all of the AI resources, whether within Equinix or outside of Equinix, right? It gives you that optionality and flexibility to go do what you need to do, where you need to do it, and when you need to do it. But that data foundation that feeds the AI beast will always be in the right place for you, right? So it's so even where the data sits in data centers, you'll also have the power to do the GPU-based inference and perhaps training, and really the fine tuning is just kind of micro training, right? It's the same kind of thing as training, but you're taking an existing model and training it further. So to have those GPUs that do training as well as do inference, and then to have the compute and data there to do your retrieval augmented generation, we support the whole life cycle of AI for an enterprise, but also, enable not just change and innovation, but things like M&A, also things like sovereignty. I think one of the best things that Dell brings to the table with the data lakehouse solution with Starburst is the ability to have data in multiple, separately governed regions that don't like sharing data. You can do your processing locally and then send roll-ups to the place where you really want to use that global data without violating laws. Well, guess what? Equinix has this IP WAN technology, for instance, that can be global or regional in nature, that can move that data, that roll-up data around in a very secure, private way. So we've got very complementary technology to each other. The Dell stuff sitting on top of the foundational Equinix stuff that really creates this very unique, differentiated strategy capability for enterprises. And I'm kind of excited to see this play out as time goes on. So with that, I guess, Tracy, do we have any questions from the field out there?
Yes, and thank you for those insights and for that guidance. There is a question that says, how easy is it to use my own company's data for AI without training my own models, as that looks prohibitively expensive?
Rob, I'll let you take that one.
Yeah, so, I think we kind of touched on that before. So there's the concept of, it's called RAG, right? Retrieval augmented generation. And that's what allows you to do that, right? So you take a standard off-the-shelf model, and then you essentially stand up what's called a vector database, where you load your data into, and then you pair that with an off-the-shelf model, and it allows you to, have it understand your company's information. So a really simple example would be like, I'm going to load my employee HR manual into that. So if somebody wants to know, ask a chatbot, how much vacation time am I allowed to get? It will know the answer because you've loaded your HR manual into it. And that's a relatively easy way to do it. The other nice advantage of that is it allows you to change the model over time. So if in a year from now, we come up with a new model that's better, you can just swap out the large language model and your database remains intact. So it gives you a lot of flexibility to do that.
Awesome. Okay, the next question is, what if I use the cloud for my AI apps today? How are Dell and Equinix helping with that?
So two ways, right? So Equinix has the most cloud on-ramps in the world, by a long shot, more than most of the people in our field, right? So we will be able to make sure that you've got the most robust, high-speed, lowest latent connections from where your data is or your processing is going to happen to wherever you're trying to get to in the cloud. So if you're doing stuff in the cloud and you want to start moving some workloads back, move data sets back, we've got a strategy for you to do that with the lowest cost factor from an egress and transit perspective. But we can help you build out a go-forward strategy for keeping the leverage over your data and workloads in your own hands instead of throwing it out to a third party. But when you add that capability with the ability Dell brings to the table, with their Apex storage options, which match their on-prem options, right? We can affect this data mobility because of again, you have to feed the beast of AI with data. Data is what starts the AI conversation, right? AI acts on data, whether it's RAG, whether it's whatever it is, especially when it's inference, in real time, that data needs to be very close to the RAG data needs to be close to the inference data. The inference engines need to be fairly close to your end users so that the response time is good. So you need a low latent network. You need to be able to share that data across boundaries with your on-prem data, with the cloud data, and Apex storage options and replication through the Dell storage options allow you to have that data where you need it at the time you're going to process it, right? So that flexibility between the two companies' offerings, they're going to complete that picture. and create that fabric of data that you need to get this thing done right. So that's why I'm kind of excited about, seeing this whole thing play out, because when you have the right pieces of the puzzle to create the go forward strategy, you have the right to change your mind later, which you're gonna, because whatever you do with AI, your use cases you find, some of them are going to work, some of them are not. You may want to try different service providers. You may want to try different clouds. You're not going to try different data because that's your data. So you have to stay in control of that. So that's when Rob said earlier that Dell's mentality is that you're going to bring AI to the data. That's what he means. You're going to have your data. So how are you getting all these AI capabilities from all of these different possible places, many of which don't exist yet? I think 3-4 years down the road, it's all going to change. You need to be in the best possible place. It's going to give you the most likely chance of being successful in the future. And that's, between Dell and Equinix, you got quite a story there.
And with that, we will say thank you and close out now and have a great day. Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks.